All right. We are live on the Modern Mantra podcast for the first time in some months, and we are back, Nick and I, and we have a bit of a different format today. We're going to be exploring a design question, a central design question that we're going to place at the center of this episode and the center of this discussion. And that design question is, how might we redesign sex education for male adolescents? And so this is a pretty juicy and full topic, and we're excited to rap about it today. How you doing, Nick?
Yeah, all good, man. Yeah, I feel like just diving like straight into the question. It's like, what is it that we weren't taught as kids? We both
Mm,
grew up in some school systems in the United States, different places, and it feels like there's just a lot of missing education. I went through like a series of schools, both public as well as Catholic. So, we taught abstinence and we also got shown some videos without any direct instruction. I think it was up until the sixth grade that any sex education was actually even covered. And I feel like it's important to break down like what this actually means. It's one of your core energy centers, right? You have this sort of nuclear power plant in your root that's always trying to take over and direct your attention and your effort and what you do in the world. I mean, we struggled through this growing up, and it feels like there's a lot of toxicity that has resulted in us not learning some of the fundamentals of how to interact with this center of intelligence in our roots and be able to direct our sexual energies in healthy ways. And that's kind of what brought up this topic, directly talking about it. I know we've touched on other episodes, but I think it's good to do a deeper dive into some of the fundamentals and maybe some things that we can introduce to the
yeah.
education.
Yeah, and I think a great place to start with this is I'm curious to know what your recollection is of your initial sex education. And that could be in school, that could be from family, that could be from friends. But when you think of what your initial education and information around sex was and sexual energy was, what did that look like for you when you were a young man?
I don't even feel like the word energy came into my field until adulthood. Like even the concept of energy, I mean, outside of electricity or outside of physics, ever came into my field until well after adulthood, after college, moving to some places where, like Bali and all these other spiritual centers where people even address energy as a concept. So what I can remember is some videos where it'd be me and my buddies sitting in the back of the classroom laughing at the pictures of the penises on the TV, of all the sexual parts, like in middle school. And then I remember there being a lot of shaming for us laughing at the videos. There'd be other more mature kids in the room laughing. And to be honest with you, I don't think I got much out of any of it. I didn't really know what the fuck was happening with my body. Um, until the last few years, where I really started to study Tantra and come into this. And I don't feel like it's a good foundation, what we're teaching our children in schools. I mean, it's also, there's so many different foundations that are even taught. You have abstinence teaching, you have like fundamentals, always use a condom, you've got all these things that just talk about the act of sex and kind of avoiding pregnancy and the problems that come with it. But we actually don't talk about sex as an energy center. So, I guess my question for you is like, what were your first recollections on it and some of the things that you weren't taught?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for reflecting that. So, I remember I had a sex education teacher named Miss Patty, and she was also a physical education teacher. So she was a PE teacher at our school, and I'm trying to remember if that was middle school or high school. But she was a PE teacher, and we had sex ed. And just like you, I do not remember coming away from that class with what I felt like was valuable information or valuable insight or anything that actually changed or altered my behavior. I don't think that I was in a space of really taking school too seriously at the time. And similar to you and what you experienced in your classroom, I also experienced a lot of laughter and joking and not really taking this thing seriously because we have our PE teacher up there talking about sexual organs. And that to some young adolescents was pretty funny. And in terms of where I, like you, did not have anybody or any outlet or any information source that really tuned me into what sex is, what sex can be, and what sexual energy is, and how it can be used and how it can be leveraged to be constructive and to be helpful and to be supportive. I never got that education. That only started to come into my field as an adult. And so when I think about my sexual education as an adolescent, one thing that was very present for me was my social surroundings and social programming and what was normalized, what was socialized. And that those experiences, I think, are what I took kind of learnings from just naturally being inspired and influenced by my environment. And in the place that I grew up in and the culture that I grew up in, there was a lot of glorification around how many people you can sleep with. Even before sleeping with someone and having intercourse, just glorification around how many women that you can hook up with. And it almost was like a numbers thing and a status thing and a glorified thing. And I don't remember anything around partner pleasure. So there was nothing in my educational experience as an adolescent around like pleasuring my partner. As a matter of fact, it was actually laughed at for going down on a female partner. Like that was actually something that was like laughed at as like, wow, you eat the box, like you eat pussy, and like that was kind of like a thing that was a bit ostracized, which is quite wild when I look back. And then another thing that I'll name here in terms of sexual education is what the popular pop culture and media, at least within the containers that I was in, what that was promoting and the images and the values that that was promoting through music and through visual. I'm sure that you remember hip hop music videos from the late 90s, early 2000s. And there is a lot in there that, again, glorifies objectifying female sexual partners, glorifies just having sex for the sake of having sex. So when I think about my sexual education as a young man, those are some of the things that come up for me.
Yeah, I mean the body count thing is the one of the strangest parts, right? And I remember the question when I was a kid of like, how far have you been? And we compared it to baseball, like a sport. Is a first base, second base, third base. Did you score? Right? It's literally like a sport where you score points. It's like how many runs do you have? How many times you've been around the bases? And I feel like a gamification for kids, it's like that's the scoreboard. A lot of things in life we're measuring grades. We're measuring how many gold stars you get, where you rank on the totem pole. And it was like whoever got laid the most, that was something to aspire to. And it's a very poor metric. And there was no, at least I do not recall there being any education or any sort of guidance around that being a poor metric. Because even from the adults in my life, I don't know what containers other people grew up with. They would ask, they'd be like, "Oh, so have you kissed her? Have you had sex with her? Is this something?" The older kids always be like, "Oh, did you get laid?" Right? Is the first question you ask as a 14-year-old when you're hanging out with a girl, and it was a source of pride to actually be able to lay a girl, right, quote unquote. And it's a really poor metric to optimize for because you're not asking about connection, right? We're not inquiring about were you ready, right? The act of penetration is the end goal for an adolescence, much like an animal, right? Just getting it all the way through and procreating rather there being, proper boundaries set. Was it consensual? Was it pleasurable? Was it something that you felt connection through? And as a result, as a young kid, you're kind of optimizing for, you know, as many partners as possible. And for a lot of people, that's what continues into adulthood. For a lot of people, like that is the extent of their perception of relationships up until the point of some serious partner into marriage. And, some of the deprogramming doesn't always hit. Even after marriage, they're still seeking that sort of scoreboard and measure themselves and their worth as a man and as a person in terms of the number of sexual partners. I see people my age even floating around my circles who still use that metric as their hero metric when it comes to connection with the other sex. And, it's something that, I think tracks back to emotional intelligence, right? When I'm thinking about this, it's like we have all these measurements that we learn as kids, kind of through media or through our friends, but there's no really emotional education that's given with that, right? Like basically you're supposed to like come out of having sex feeling like the fucking man, high-fiving your buddies, be like, I just got laid, motherfucker, right? And that's the expectation. Like afterwards, you're gonna feel great. You're a man now. Congratulations, you win. And there's no aftercare, right? There's no aftercare for that individual. And that individual might also be looking to get laid again, despite the consequences, or have other partners. And I think it's a really poor introduction to something that's core to us, which is our sexual holistic health.
Yeah, and one thing that comes up for me when you mention that is this concept of integration. And when we think about, any sort of ceremony that we would take part in, let's say a plant medicine ceremony or a song ceremony or any sort of ceremonial space, there's usually a follow-up of having some intentional integration period of how do you actually integrate this experience. And when I reflect back, there was such a lack of support in integration from the adults around me, from the educators around me. And what I'm getting at here is like I remember having some of my first sexual experiences and having no way to integrate that, having no way to contextualize that, having no way to place that. And one thing that is coming up for me is the first time, and I just want to preface by saying that sex is not about ejaculation. Sex is not about ejaculation in any means. But for me, the first time that I ejaculated was a wild experience for me because I've never experienced that in my body, in my life. I've never experienced that sensation. I've never experienced that substance coming out of my body. And when that happened for the first time, it's like a whole portal opened up for me. And I had no fucking idea what sense to make of it or what to do with that or how to integrate that. I'm curious if you've had a similar experience, if you're open to sharing, like what your first experience was with ejaculation and what your response was to that and how you handled that.
I didn't know what the fuck happened. So, like, similar to you, I think as a kid I would play with myself, and then one day it just kind of like got to the point where that first thing happened. I didn't know what happened, but it felt fucking great. And I think that also started, a series of me masturbating very frequently as a kid, and not really knowing what to do with it. And, you know, something that got brought up, I think is really interesting. I don't think it's something I haven't even thought about is after your first sexual experience, the support system around you, you know, because you're afraid as a young adolescent to tell a parent, right? My mother's reaction to knowing the things I did when I was 15, 16 years old, I can't even imagine sharing something like that with my parents or any adult for that reason, right? Like the priest would shame you, the parents would shame you. I actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure if I ever shared my sexual experiences with anybody, with any adult. Like the only context that I had to share those experiences with was my direct friend groups. Obviously, the internet nowadays. Now there's a lot of weird place in the internet talking about sex, but in that time period, there was no like tribe level support system to help guide me through, the aftercare and the integration and all the feelings and emotions associated with it. It was a foreign concept, and it still is to this day for a lot of kids growing up all over the world. Like, there is no safe space to talk about sex in most households for most children, just based on my experience. I don't know what conscious communities some other people live in, but where I came from, that was not a concept.
Yeah, and same for me when I think about it. The safest space that I had, lucky enough and fortunate enough, was my father. I felt like I had someone that I could talk openly to about sexual experiences and not be met with judgment, and not be met and not feel the fear of rejection, and know that he would hold that space. I don't think that I utilized that to its full advantage, because I don't think I had the awareness of understanding what safe space was, and recognizing the value of utilizing that. And another thing that I want to weave into this conversation is the advent of pornography, because I imagine that has played a role in a lot of young men's kind of sexual education. I know that I mentioned the music, the culture, the social programming, but another aspect of that really forms and shapes, I think, sexual perspectives is pornography. And there are some insane statistics of internet usage and the amount of traffic that is going into pornography sites that that indicate that there is a lot more porn viewership happening than a lot of people care to give credit for. And I think when we talk about sexual education for young male adolescents, I think we have to include the big factor of pornography as potentially being the initial entry point for a lot of young men's sexual experiences, and perhaps a lot of young men's first ejaculatory experiences. And so I think what we're doing here is just mapping out a host of different factors that come into play here, factors that have come into play for us.
Yeah, we didn't have this when we were kids, right? Like, I remember, like, I mean, we had a family computer, which became progressively more advanced as we came up, but we are the last generation not to have cell phones. We're the last generations not to have direct access in our pockets to any pornography that we want to consume. And furthermore, I want to share an interesting statistic. So, on average, okay, men in the last 3 decades have lost 50% of their testosterone across the United States. Just to put that in perspective,
What?
the average 22-year-old male today has roughly the same testosterone level as a 67-year-old in the year 2000. It's fallen about 50% in the last 2 decades, if you can believe it, on average. And this is a real stat. I'm reading this from USA Today, and there's many different sources cited on this. And I, for one, believe, I mean, people point to diets, people point to Saturn, the planets, whatever. I think it's pornography. I feel that from a very young age, many of us have gotten into the habit of constant ejaculation and constant self pleasure, just due to the availability of whatever kink you want around the internet, that's leading to a massive spike, a massive downturn in our testosterone in men. And I think it's one of the great sicknesses that is very far too under the radar.
Yeah, and so can you expand or elaborate on the connection between testosterone dropping and pornography viewership, and what that connective tissue is?
Yeah, definitely. So testosterone, I mean, it does a lot of things, and it's produced in a lot of different ways, but it is unique to males in that it is a very abundant substance that gets our sex drive going, right? People always talk about like lack of testosterone, later age, you kind of lose your sex drive, right? And that is one of its primary functions. It serves a lot of purposes in the body, but one of the primary functions is that it is more prevalent in males because it motivates us to sex. Okay. So you can almost think of it like your sex fuel, right? Your sex fuel is then released upon ejaculation, right? So it's a very different testosterone level if you have ejaculated 3 times today versus 3 times in the past year, right? So you literally will have months of a time if you do not ejaculate, saving up your testosterone that can be leverage for different things. And this is your body's life force as a man. Like you can leverage your testosterone to accomplish things at work, to go work out, to hold presence, right? This is a fundamental fuel in your body that people see as something cheap, something that is because of pornography and how prevalent it is, it's something that is given away for nothing for free multiple times a day for many men across the country. There's this rise in men becoming cognizant that by refusing to ejaculate. And by the way, orgasm is different than ejaculation. You can have an orgasm as a man without ejaculating, but by ejaculating, you are giving away your testosterone and it does not give your body the time to refuel. So there's a very prevalent problem of over masturbation. I shouldn't even call it masturbation. Masturbation is great, but over ejaculation, where men are giving away their most vital life source in their bodies for nothing, right? You are getting nothing out of that interaction. That exchange is your attention going into a porn site and you feeling depleted after that interaction for temporary pleasure. And it's something that, we're very ashamed to talk about. I mean, when's the last time we talked about masturbation and how many times you're coming a day with your buddies, right? With your parents, with your friends, or with your girlfriend? It's normally something that's done in shame. It's normally something that's done in secret. It's something that we put a taboo over and it's done in private. And as a result, you have probably most men are ejaculating on a daily basis and not realize the negative effects it has on our testosterone levels, which is why we've lost half of it as a society over the last 2 decades.
Wow. Yes. And so it's very clear that the sexual education that we're being provided in the classroom is not necessarily as effective as we need it to be, just given all of the various things that we can point to on planet Earth, both currently and historically, that can, in some way, shape, or form, track back to misusage of male sexual energy. And so I think when we think about that context that we just set, there are a few different things that come up for me in terms of where it can go or how to kind of move in the direction of a solution. It sounds like there are different stages of this process. And even within adolescence and even within sex education, as a young male whose body is changing, there are three kind of pillars that are popping up for me. One is purely around education. So actually providing information and providing information to, in a relevant way, in a relevant context, to make young men aware of what testosterone is, what this is, what that is. So actually a contextualized way to make these things relevant and provide that information. Another pillar is thinking of different mechanisms that support behavior changes, right? So, for example, one behavior change that we kind of touched on a little bit is pornography and the over-viewership of pornography. That's a whole other range of solution kind of pathways to think in. Like, how can we actually create or design mechanisms that actively shift behaviors? One of those behaviors could be preventing the overviewership of pornography, etc. And then the last thing that comes up for me is this integration piece and thinking, there are a bunch of solution pathways there around how you can support young men post having a sexual experience, and what does that integration look like? And so those are some of the things that come up for me in terms of different areas that could potentially be tackled or zoomed in on.
One thing I've seen become more prevalent is the concept of nofap. It's like, and there's actually a Reddit forum called nofap where they celebrate not releasing and not ejaculating. And you can actually go there and see the thousands upon thousands of posts of all the positive benefits that these men have gotten from not releasing. And it's an interesting place because normally, in context of the internet and growing up, we glorify the number of women that you ejaculate with, right? It's like, oh, I fucked her and it was great. And I came just like the pornos. And it was like, that's what I was going after. Versus on NoFap, what they're celebrating is how long it's been since you've ejaculated, right? And how well that you are maintaining composure over your sexual desires and that yearning to ejaculate. I think shifting the context as to what the hero metrics are and what the goal should be and what we celebrate as a society is a really good first step.
Yes. And I think one stage setting thing that I would ask you is, from your experience, from your vantage point where you're at now, what is sexual energy, and what are the ways that sexual energy can be constructive?
Yeah, well, I'm a big believer in all the different energy centers in the body. So as a society, we're very mind oriented. Like when you think about thinking, it comes from your head, right? We imagine the brain, we imagine everything just above the nose, and this is where thought happens. But that is not the truth or the case. You have an emotional center in many different parts of your body. The other most prevalent ones, in my opinion, are the heart. You feel things in your chest, right? When you have something that doesn't feel right, what happens? Your heart feels heavy and it drops down to your stomach, right? And likewise, when you feel that sexual energy coming on, or some girl turns you on, where do you feel it? It's in your root, right? So we have these energy centers that have these different flavors of intelligence, right? Like our root will tell us when something turns us on. Our gut will tell us when something doesn't feel right. Our heart will tell us when something feels very open and free and an invitation comes through. So when I think of our sexual energy centers, I think of our root chakra. And there's a lot of intelligence that comes with that information. Now should always be trusted. Okay. That is a different question. And it really comes from understanding, your intentions in a given situation. Also, if you have not ejaculated in 3 weeks, right, it's not something that always should be trusted. As in, like, oh, this girl turns me on, I should procreate with her, because that's your body's natural inclination to reproduce. Remember that you are the result of a multi-billion-year-old family tradition of reproduction. Okay, literally all your ancestors leading up until this point have had sex and had to reproduce in order to produce you. So that yearning to procreate is normal. But when you feel that energy, it's important to be mindful of it and alchemize it. So when you feel that energy coming from your root chakra, what we can do is actually transition it, right? I can take a big breath and bring it up my spine, maybe stand a little bit taller, right? And the more that we actually save that energy, we can actually channel it into different things. Maybe channel it into our work, channel it into our art, channel it into wherever you feel like you're having the most long-term value, rather than channeling it into something where you have short-term release and no long-term value produced. So I see it as kind of like a nuclear energy plant, and it's always producing energy. And training are meant on the ability to recognize when it is producing that energy and alchemize it and channel it into the things that produce long-term benefits, rather than just trying to get in some girl's pants, being a bit pushy, right? They call it thinking with your dick, or thinking with your head and not your head, being the head of your dick. That's something that it comes with training, and it's something that we have to be cognizant of, men, because that can get you some fucked up situations. That energy, if it's not mindfully allocated, can get you in some real trouble.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I reflect all that, receiving all of that. For me, the sexual energy is a form of creative life force energy, and that is some energy that has creative potential to create life on Earth. And like you're saying, we can channel that from our lower triangle to our upper triangle and use that in a number of different ways. And so, in thinking of, so what I mapped out before in terms of there being this educational piece, this behavioral piece, this integration piece, I feel like those can essentially track back to a before sexual experience, a during sexual experience, and after sexual experiences. And maybe there's not a direct mapping, but it feels like that could be the case. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on a around a starting point, around like when you think of high impact actions from an MVP perspective, right? Just what are the highest impact actions, or what are the most potent and impactful points of intervention, or points of prevention, or points of education? I'm curious what comes up for you.
Well, for me, it's first getting attuned to the other intelligence centers of the body, right? When we ask somebody, their opinion on something, what do we say? What do you think? What do you think? You think of the brain. In your mind, what do you think? Versus how does it make you feel? What are you feeling right now? Where do you feel it in your body? What does that feeling feel like? Right? Because when you use your other emotional intelligence centers, what's happening is that you're getting attuned to your body's holistic intelligence, that of which your sexual root chakra becomes a much more prevalent part later on in life. We talked about the moment that ours felt quote unquote activated. We felt a rush of energy we never felt at any point in our lives in any other context coming from that place. So the earliest intervention or training in education is simply asking the child, how does it make you feel? Where do you feel it in your body? When it comes to their emotional decision making, not asking them what they think, but letting them express themselves through their body, right? And giving them the space to kind of explore those emotions and those feelings, because when it comes to that root chakra being activated, it's going to become 1,000 times more important to pay attention to those signals that these other intelligence centers are giving us.
Yeah, and that what comes up for me there is context. And it sounds like there's a bit of a zooming out of saying instead of just focusing on this one energy center and this one form of energy, how can we actually contextualize that within the reality that we have multiple energy centers? And so looking at it from like an energy anatomy standpoint.
And one thing that comes up is maybe energy is not the right word. Maybe it's even personifying these things in different ways. Like the energy that comes from your heart, looking and feeling and have a certain taste, texture, and maybe a different word, right? I mean, it's like the Inuits. They've got dozens and dozens of words for snow. Maybe we need more words for energy and the intelligence of where it comes from. We say thinking is the head, feeling is the body, right? And maybe we need more specific words. Maybe it's like, what are you hearting right now? It comes from your heart. Well, what are you rooting right now? It comes from your root. More specific words to describe where in the body these energies come from, so that a child can understand it. A way to personify it, right, and have the words to be able to express what the hell is going on.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I'm curious what comes up when you think about format of that, right? Because I can see several different ways that that can manifest, right? One is in the form of curriculum that gets put into a school. One might be in the form of a game, a physical board game or card game that friends can play with each other or can play with family. Maybe that's another thing that comes up. Another format is some sort of digital application. Another format is maybe some form of in-person centers that youth can go to and attend to get more in touch and more of an understanding of their breakdown of these power centers.
Well, this is the weird thing, right? It's different for everybody. And this is not something that we really are cognizant of. For example, even when it comes to thought, right? A lot of people don't know this. About 1 in 20 people in the world don't have an inner voice. You know that voice in your head, and some of you listening don't have it? Okay? Some people actually watch movies. That when the character goes into monologue and the voice starts talking, people look at that and like, damn, that would be very useful if I had that. Right? I actually had this funny dinner where we were talking about this concept, and I was like, some people don't have an inner voice. And there's a girl at the table, and she's like, what do you guys mean? And we're like, what do you mean? She's like, and the like, how do you think? And she's like, what do you mean? I just have thoughts. I'm like, and there's no voice association? She's like, no. Never had a voice in my head. I don't hear anything in my head. I'm like, your voice, you don't talk to yourself? She's like, no, I just do things. And the weird thing is, she is the happiest person I've ever met. She's genuinely one of the most happy, content, lovely people I've ever interacted with. And she does not have an inner voice. So it's a long way to say that even when it comes down to thought, we assume everyone thinks similarly, right? But now what we're doing is aiming to map our feelings. So to even tell a child, this is how you feel, right? This is how it should feel, I think is inaccurate, right? I feel like it's more training the child in understanding how their body speaks to them, right? So when something feels really good, maybe put a marshmallow in front of them and say, hey, do you want this marshmallow? Yes. How does it feel in your body? Well, I feel it in my stomach because I'm hungry. I feel it in my heart because I like it. I feel it in my head because I can feel the sugar that's about to enter it. You know, understanding how a yes feels in different contexts and how a no feels. Like for me, and I've done trainings like this before, it feels like my heart is expanding when it's something is a fuck yes. I am like, my heart is open, I'm expanding into it, and it's like my energy feels encompassing that person or that activity or that opportunity that's in front of me, and I get goosebumps, which actually I call truth bumps. It's like the truth is coming out, and this is a truth for me. Versus a no, I feel like I'm backed into a corner and somebody's approaching me with a belt. I feel small, and I feel like a mouse that wants to run into a hole in the corner of the room. So for me, it's a very tactile feeling of my heart expanding or contracting. It's a yes or a no. This experience is different for everybody, right? And this is something that even as adults, a lot of us don't necessarily learn. It's like, how does our higher self or energy center say yes versus no? Because it doesn't come from thought normally. It normally maps at the subconscious level. And then only then does it come up into the thought where we can even express the feeling and the reaction that we have.
Mm, yeah, I hear that fully. One thing that's coming up for me based on that share is mentorship and just the role that people that have a little bit more life experience can play. And in a lot of cases, and it sounds like maybe in our cases as well, folks or young men that are not getting the support that they need inside of schools or even in the household, thinking of, well, where are those support systems, where are those support people that can guide or that can mentor and that can coach through the process. I feel like that seems like it would be incredibly valuable, even on a one-to-one basis. It just, that one-to-one model is not super duper scalable. But at the same time, what I'm hearing from what you're saying, it seems like somebody playing that role could be very, very valuable.
And that's the way these things normally start, right? It starts in a consultation, in a one-to-one. It moves up into productized consultation, where you might have 20 people, 20 kids at the same time in a classroom setting learning this. And then eventually it bubbles up to product. Now, for adults, there's many different places to go to understand your intuition. There's many different practices that we have available to us to understand your intuition. When we talk about flipping it for the child, it's a different context and different container. But I feel like everything maps back to being able to visualize and express, how does your body say yes? How does your body say no? How does that information propagate to my yes and to my no? Sometimes it comes from your root, sometimes it comes from your heart. And maybe one of the exercises is actually having a child draw, like, this is how my body says yes to me. This is how my body says no to me. This is how I experience this intuition. And this goes back to conversation we had recently. Now I'm thinking about it, with somebody who we might want to have the podcast about this exact subject. Because if you can understand what that feels like for you, and maybe you're in a situation, your buddies are talking about body count, and that doesn't feel right. Right? You're having these emotion in your body. You're experiencing anxiety in your gut. You're experiencing some distraught in your root, right? Understanding what those signals are to navigate even that situation, rather than be like, yeah, man, like I'm going to fuck 3 girls this year, right? It's like, that is really the foundation to a much healthier relationship with sex and relationship with the world as a whole.
Yeah, I feel like having a place where I can essentially track those yeses and nos or track those emotional states in those times, in real time, right, in those times of experience, could be incredibly valuable. I know for me as a young man, there were a lot of times and a lot of scenarios where I was just going along with whatever the fuck was happening, but internally I was feeling incongruent and I was feeling out of alignment with what was happening and what I was going along with in that moment. And so when you talk about like tuning into that intuition and tuning into what is my body telling me? What are these different power centers telling me? What am I experiencing? What am I feeling in this moment? And having a place or a way where you can feel supported in expressing that or tracking that or flagging that, I feel like that alone is a great tool kit for somebody to have. And that's one that I think I could have done well with. I think the one thing that comes up for me with that is how to put how to put a young man into a space of feeling comfortable being vulnerable and being expressive, because that's a big growth edge that I had as well, is maybe bottling stuff in and not really being able to express it even if I am feeling it in that moment. So one kind of precursor or prerequisite that comes up for me in that is like, how do we actually open that door for people to feel comfortable maybe saying how they feel or tracking how they feel or flagging how they're feeling in any given moment?
I feel like it comes from example, right? Like I've seen children with incredible emotional intelligence, right? But I know their parents, right? And I've also seen children as well as young men who have very little ability to express themselves. I feel like it comes from the examples that we're taught what is okay, right? Like I was taught from a very young age to bottle my emotions, to respond with anger, right? And to run away and hide. That was the primary way that I learned how to deal with stress as a young man because I observed it from my parents, right? I was in a situation where this is the way my whole family dealt with these emotions, right? We would literally go hide in our bedrooms away from each other, create space to avoid, any sort of interaction or any sort of conflict. And that became the primary means by which I dealt with things all the way into adulthood. So I feel like it's a big part of it comes from example. How do the people that we look up to lead and express vulnerability? How do they express anger? How do they express sadness? And we copy that, right? And I feel like opening that space and giving a healthy example of what that feels like and allowing peers to kind of come into it, and then celebrating the people who can do this and open up in a healthy way is a good first step. I don't think it's going to work for everybody, but and we're also talking about kids here, right? Like their programming is deep, right? And they are a direct result of their initial environment, right? Like these kids they're only on their first worldview. Your first worldview comes from your parents and from your immediate environment. Your second one is normally when you rebel against the first one. And it's a very natural progression, right? So if they're not in that rebellious stage, they might not feel comfortable even considering this as a path to vulnerability or expression.
Mm. Yeah, and when I think about those examples, I think about, as a young black man growing up in Brooklyn, having older like mentor figures that kind of had a shared experience, I think was few and far between. I'm very grateful to have my father in my life, but when I look around me at my surroundings, I feel like a lot of those adult figures, those adult mentor figures that had a shared lived experience that could provide me with this support, I didn't feel like that was really there. And so one thing that comes up for me when you say what you just said is, the ability to match people and match those good examples of maybe people that have more life experience, adults, matching those folks, matching those coaches or what have you with these younger adolescents. Because I think that it's one thing for a PE teacher to get up in front of a classroom and tell you whatever they're going to tell you. It's another thing to actually have someone that shares and reflects some lived experience or some group identity, like some level of compatibility that can actually be that example and maybe encourage you to walk along this journey of tuning into those yeses and nos and tuning into how you can express in those moments. And I know that you've had experience with a tantric coach, and that was in your adult life, right? But I'm curious if you can see any of those modalities that you've gained in your adult life through this tantric coaching translating into, let's say, an 11 or 12-year old.
What we're talking about when we speak about sexual energy is Tantra. It's the study of that essential life force, that creative energy, as you described it earlier, and leveraging it for healthy context in your life. Like we have the sexual energy. Most people deplete it on a daily or multiple daily basis, right? Without even being conscious of how they do it. It becomes habit, masturbation, versus leveraging it for something greater, right? Like I don't think if you're a man here who is in the habit of coming every day, like take a couple days, don't do it. And by the way, you can still masturbate, right? You can still masturbate all the way up until the point of ejaculation, but just don't come and see how you feel. That practice and that learning of how good, holistic, grounded I can feel without ejaculation is a very good starting point. On top of that, with the Tantra coaching, sex felt like, and this is this woman, Melissa, she's My Pleasure Studio on Instagram. She's amazing. It felt very playful for the first time. My sexual energy, my sexual exploration felt very playful. And it felt like I had somebody I could speak to that had no taboo. I could sit there talking about my craziest sexual desires and dreams and everything I was experiencing as a man and be met without judgment and be met in a place where it felt normal. Like to this day, whenever I have like a crazy relationship situation or I don't know how to navigate, I'll call Melissa. And all my friends who are having similar experiences, I'll actually direct them to that resource because sex always felt very heavy. It either was a funny matter or a very serious one or completely taboo growing up. And each one of those lenses creates a situation where some things are appropriate and some things are not. Right. And I feel like one of the first things we can do is remove that taboo and provide and simplify these practices that maybe one in every 1,000 men gets exposed to in adulthood, right? And bring them to a simplified version for our kids and let them decide. Because if I learned these things at a younger age, I think I would be much better off at this stage of my life.
And what would have been the best way for you to learn those at that younger age? Would it have been coming from an adult figure? Would it have been maybe reading or listening to something?
For me, I'm a very visual thinker. So, like, even to this day, we talked about like the sex video. I can remember the video. I remember the pictures on the video. But a lot of kids also grow up playing sports, right? It's like interactive activities where you build memory muscle. So I feel as though bringing these down to a simplified game of sorts, something they can actually interact with, right? And that has a user interface that I can learn these concepts without it being taboo, without it being funny, without it being something that I can actually get into in order to learn and have some depth to would be a great starting point. I mean, similar to the video games I would play as a kid, I would get obsessed with video games.
Yeah, I hear that in terms of that visual education through that interface. And one other element that seems like it could be very useful is a log or some element of logging. And what I mean by logging is being able to log those yeses and nos, right? Being able to log those emotions of what I'm feeling in these moments. Potentially even being able to log how many days I go without watching porn or log how many days I go without ejaculating. And maybe that is part of the interactivity.
Another great tool that I've been reading about is the rise of virtual reality. There's a really interesting experience. I can't remember the name of the artist off the top of my head, but it was an experience where you enter into this virtual world and you're a black man being called the N word. And it's designed for schools in the South where it is still prevalent to use that sort of vocabulary. So you experience firsthand what it's like to receive that level of hate from random individuals around you. And the results were pretty extraordinary. The empathy that you feel in being in that situation, the emotions that you feel being attacked, right? And putting on that skin, even if it's in a virtual world, were quite potent. So I bring this up because, there are I believe, a lot of emerging opportunities integrating VR education, right? Actually putting somebody, and it's not like a funny game where there's pictures on the screen where, a dick enters a vagina. I'm talking about them actually being in a situation where they're being propositioned with sex and they're not into it, right? Or giving proposition sex and just ask them, like, hey, how are you feeling right now? Where in your body do you feel it? Right? Creating a feedback loop so that if and when that situation arises, they know how to navigate it. Because the weirdest part, like thinking back as a kid, I was in the sixth grade and one of the girls offered to give me a blowjob, right? And it was actually in front of a group of people, right? She's like, "Yeah, like I'll take you back to the back of the school and I'll suck your dick right now." And I was like, I don't know what to do. Like, I've got, my root ancestral program. He's like, "Oh yeah, like let's go do it." And then everyone's around me like, "Oh dude, like you should do it." You know what I mean? And then I'm like thinking about my church, I'm thinking about my family, I'm thinking about school. Like, I don't know, like, can I do this in school? Like, and I didn't know what to do, right? And this girl continually propositioned me for sex. I think at this point I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. Didn't know what the fuck to do with it. And, we didn't have any training for that sort of situation, right? These videos that are being taught in our middle school class don't prepare us for these things. So some sort of hands-on education, whether it be in a virtual reality context, or maybe there's some other context in which we can train our men. For example, I think another tantric practice that I've learned and have been really integrating is consent. Consent around touch, consent around romance, around friendships, and creating safe environments for more intimate containers. So, I do cranial sacral massages and I'm a very touchy person by default. And I've gotten into the habit of always asking for consent. I'll ask, can I touch your shoulders? Can I touch your head? Can I touch your chest? Is there anywhere you don't want me to touch? Being very, very clear in that consensual container before we actually go into the act of that physical touch, because it's very easy to see the pornos and learn, right? And integrate, this is how you touch a woman in a sensual place, right? This is how intimacy begins and this is how it ends. Okay. It begins with possibly very rough interactions and it ends with ejaculation, right? Figuring out like what consent means in that environment, actually practicing it, right? Asking for consent to hold someone's hand, asking for consent to touch their shoulder, right? And not from a place of pressure. And I think this goes, we're talking a lot about men because that's our perspective, but also for women, if that doesn't feel right, you're welcome to say no. I don't want you to touch there, but you can touch me here. You can continue establishing consent and healthy boundaries with your partner. That's another idea for a real world implementation of this. So to get children more comfortable with consent and with deliberate touch.
Yeah, and what comes up for me within that is principles, and defining what are some baseline principles to create a framework with which one can operate, right? Because when I think of consent, I also think of power dynamics and social dynamics that exist. And unfortunately, the power dynamics that exist across different gender identities and across different sexes, and to become aware of these principles, to have an operating framework, I feel like is where my mind goes when you talk about teaching consent, when you talk about training for consent and exposing young men to the idea of consent. What comes up for me is creating an operating framework so that I have a compass or some understanding of how I can navigate these situations. And starting with some educational component around maybe what is consent? What does this mean? What does this look like? And then also thinking about what that hands-on piece can be. And when I think of hands-on, I think of maybe in real time being able to log your experiences or speak to your experiences or track those experiences, but also what you're naming is leveraging some virtual reality to simulate real life situations and actually gauge what you're feeling in those simulated moments.
It's a couple of ideas. And, even, what this brings up for me is even in my adult life, I have been blessed, absolutely blessed to have so many incredible people floating around me. It's a very conscious community here in Portugal, and it's a very conscious community who's comfortable with physical touch. So, and I have a lot of friends who are girls, and I have one friend I always see. He asks me, he's like, "Hey man, how's your week?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, I did this, this, this." He's like, "Oh yeah, did you have sex with her?" I'm like, "No, it's just not really the intention in this container or whatever." He's like, "You're telling me that da 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 happened and you didn't have sex, dude? Come on, right?" And this is a long way to say, I feel like a lot of this comes back to what do we celebrate, right? Even in the context of that container between a young man and a young woman, are we celebrating the score, right, and actually getting laid, or are we celebrating a healthy long-term relationship within healthy boundaries, right? And are we celebrating having close, consensual, platonically intimate experiences that really support you throughout your whole journey? I think it's very sad that, as most adult men, our access to touch comes down to partnership normally, right? For most of us, it is exclusively with sometimes family, get occasional hug or kiss, or within partnership. It doesn't come from any other place. I feel like this is one of the biggest detriments to the human experience is a result of our childhood sexual education, because we didn't know how to ask for consent, because we did not know how to talk about healthy relationships without it moving to a romantic area. There's literally like billions of missed opportunities for very deep and intimate human contact because of the lack of boundaries and consent between these individuals. And I'm very blessed to again have this training and to know how to navigate these platonically intimate arenas. I feel like that alone would help heal a lot of the wounds of the masculine feminine. I've had people come to me and express to me, "Hey, I've never really had this sort of relationship with somebody who's a man. It's something that's foreign to me." And I didn't know how to navigate this as a younger man. Like 5, 6 years ago, I didn't know about any of this. I was afraid to touch anybody. Like, physical touch to me felt like intention to move beyond and climb that relationship escalator into relationship or to sex. And I got very fortunate that I had some great teachers who taught me how to navigate physical touch, both in the form of friends that became lovers and in the form of like actual mentors in the form of Tantric coaches. So yeah, it's a long way to say that physical touch, boundary setting, it can be a powerful tool both for men, and if we can teach it to children very early on, teaching them how to say yes, how to say no, how their bodies react to these situations. And also, if you experience physical touch and you feel it in your root, that does not always mean you should make a move, right? Like, all you want to do early on, and if you haven't had sex before, is like get the lay, right? You're trying to like get in there versus, actually like feeling it, accepting it, and then alchemizing it or repurposing it to something more healthy, right? Like that tension can be useful, but it has to be alchemized in the correct way and not use. I mean, again, it's like a nuclear power plant. It can either power the body, or it can burn it down, and you can have a reactor meltdown, and it'll get you into some really bad situations. So can't remember the question, but that's a little bit.
Yeah, totally. So what I heard around platonic relationships and what I know about platonic relationships is that we don't have any mechanisms in place that are widespread that actually teach young men and even young women how to cultivate platonic opposite sex relationships. And I'm hearing that. I'm also hearing consent. I've also heard about like energy anatomy and power center anatomy. And to me, I feel like these elements can, and there are more, right? I think it takes actually sitting down and mapping out these different elements, but I can see some forming of some operational framework, some program. And I can see that program for each of these pillars, whether that's consent or whether that's touch or whether that's energy anatomy, like each of these pillars having some educational component, some visual interactive educational component, and perhaps followed up with or integrated with some activity component where I'm being prompted to go out and maybe complete certain missions or complete certain challenges. And also thinking if there are ways to gamify that experience, ways to have some ways to motivate and ways to reward and incentivize good behavior. And another thing that comes up for me is, thinking of the right context for something like this, and whether that context is within the school setting or whether that context is going maybe direct to a household. But yeah, curious what your thoughts are there.
Schools are difficult, right? Because there's a lot of opinions on how to teach sex. I mean, across every state, and a lot of it's left to the state, there are different approaches. And, you, you know, I think when it comes to this sort of teaching, I think the best approach would be, first starting out with, really deliberate feedback sessions. And man, replacing sex education in schools with something like this would be mighty powerful. Mighty powerful. With that said, if there is going to be physical touch between the kids, you definitely need the right moderator, right? You need somebody who's trained properly, who's been background checked, right? Talking about kids' sexuality, putting somebody in that position is extremely important that they are the right person. But if it was an informative digital experience and something that a kid could explore on their own, right? Or even like open up the software and say, hey, look, I just experienced this situation. How do I cope with it? Right. I think there also could be an element of some sort of therapist or coaching, right? You have like the school counselor, which it's hit or miss with those guys, right? I think we've had good ones. I think you've had bad ones, right? Who in the event, if something sexually traumatic happened to you, you had a question you could, in theory, approach. Maybe there is a way to have the software even open so that you can ask a question or raise a concern or be able to speak to somebody that's trusting, right, in an anonymized fashion to get answers from somebody you trust that has the whole context, right? I mean, a lot of these things, again, they live in taboo. There's a lot of shame around it. So if there was some sexual trauma in the event that I did have sex, right, depending on the funny lens, the taboo lens, the you shouldn't be doing that lens, right? Having it in a place where I know it will be responded to and in a safe and normatized environment could also be a healthy means for a child to express what they're going through and get help or get proper guidance as to how to navigate that situation.
Yeah, and I feel like the younger generation is more and more accustomed to text as a mode of communication. And one application that I like a lot is called Noom. It's Noom, and it's actually a weight loss program. It's a digital weight loss program, and it kind of has some of these mechanisms of logging your activity. And there's also a support person, whether that's a therapist or a coach, that you can hit up in the app on the DMs. And that person does also have a view into all the activity that you've currently done on the app, what you've been logging, what you're tracking, etc. And I'm thinking of a similar mechanism here of being able to have that safe container, being able to have that figure there that you can openly express to, and perhaps in an anonymous fashion. And earlier I was thinking about mentorship and adult examples in the form of like one-to-one real-time coaching. But thinking in the context of a digital application, I feel like there's a huge use case and value in text-based communication for children of this age, because it seems like that is a space where they are increasingly comfortable expressing. And perhaps that, and of course research would need to be done on that, but that's the general assumption at the moment and what seems like it could make sense.
Well, sex education, I think, is one part of this. Also, mentorship, right? Having somewhere you can go to actually talk to somebody who's properly trained and can respond to things properly, I think is another avenue this could help, right? Let's suppose there's like a question that's coming up constantly, maybe even like having a place they can go to, like, how do I actually train my students in this, right? If there is a question around, I don't know, whatever it might be, but actually having not only that information to be able to make that call saying, hey, this is something that's experienced by my students, and then having a resource to go to in order to have a strategy or an intervention in order to properly train them on these things and empower our therapists or our teachers in order to implement these educational courses in our classrooms. I mean, when we're talking about education, we're talking about schools, at least in the United States, and introducing some of these best practices and these feedback loops, I feel is one of the best things we can do to be a good ancestor.
Mm, yes. I feel like that's a great place to leave it at. And that's the theme of the month, y'all, is being a good ancestor. And this was the first how might we question that we dove into. It sounds like where we're kind of finishing this off at is, the now would be some form of a digital application that could have some educational aspects and some interactivity, as well as maybe some text-based coaching. Maybe a next could be thinking about how these principles and practices make their way into classroom. And then if you extend that out with the proliferation of VR technology and hardware, actually thinking about how do you simulate real life experiences and sense and gauge what you're feeling in those moments. So with that, I think we'll put a completion to this episode. How's that feel?
Yeah, let's let it rock. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Peace.